Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome to another installment of this video series on Skew-Ts and Hodographs. If you recall, in our last video, we discussed how to construct a Skew-T from raw data. And we're going to build off that in this video. And we're actually going to calculate some environmental parameters that you can get directly from some analysis on the Skew-T. So now, as I said it in the last video, I'll say it again here. You're probably never going to have to construct your own Skew-T from raw data. You're probably never going to have to actually calculate these parameters on your own. However, it's really good to know where these parameters come from and how they're calculated. Instead of just looking at a certain parameter, looking at a number and saying, oh yeah, that's what that means. It's good to know where that actually comes from so you can better understand what those parameters actually signify and represent. So before we get started, if you haven't seen the first two videos in this series, I recommend that you do go back and watch those before diving into this video, as we'll be building on what we've talked about previously. I'll put the links for those two videos in the description, and I'll put the link for the second video as well up in the top right corner of this video. So let's get started here. As we said in the last video, we actually started to construct this Skew-T diagram from the raw data. And this is that Skew-T diagram completed. So all the points have been filled in, that temperature profile completed. Of course, we just did a few points in the interest of time in the last video. This is the entire Skew-T plotted here. Of course, the red line is our environmental temperature profile measured by the sounding. And the green line is our dew point profile as measured by the sounding package. And I've drawn in our parcel trace here in black. And if you recall, just a quick review on how we calculated or how we determined what our parcel trace would be. We started at the surface from our surface temperature. We went up along the dry adiabat. And then from our surface dew point, we went up along the corresponding mixing ratio line. Where those two met is when the parcel becomes saturated, and from that point we went up along the moist adiabat up through the atmosphere. Now let's get into these parameters here, and we've already kind of found one. We talked about it briefly in the last video, and that's this point right here. That's the lifted condensation level, or lifting condensation level, abbreviated as LCL. And the LCL is basically that point where the dry adiabat corresponding to the surface temperature and the mixing ratio line corresponding to the surface dew point meet. So it's this point right here. And basically it's just the level where the parcel that has been forced upward becomes saturated. So we've basically taken this parcel and we've pushed it upward in the atmosphere. It's an unsaturated parcel, and as it goes up it's going to cool and it's eventually going to become saturated. And where it does, that's the LCL. So it's basically the lowest sort of theoretical cloud base you can have. And it has pretty interesting implications on tornadogenesis in supercells. We've actually found that supercells in environments where the LCL is actually lower tend to favor tornadogenesis, whereas higher LCLs tend to prohibit tornadogenesis. And that's because simply think of tornadogenesis as a connection between the rotational loft and the surface. If there's less distance between that rotational loft and the surface, there's less stuff to get in the way of that connection, and that connection can happen a lot easier. But if the LCLs are a lot higher, there's a lot more a lot more air to go through, a lot more potential obstacles for that connection to happen. And higher LCLs tend to promote more outflow production, and outflow tends to undercut strong rotating updrafts, negating the tornado potential. So LCL here, it's measured in millibars. So it's basically just a pressure level, but I've also seen it in meters above ground level, and often on the SPC pages, on the SPC soundings, and on the mesoanalysis pages, you'll see it denoted in meters above ground level. So in this case, our LCL, we would just take our pressure level here. We would go across here, and it looks to be somewhere about right in here. And I've kind of labeled this sounding to make it a little bit easier for you guys to see. The temperatures down here on the bottom, they were labeled here on the side, here, each temperature line or isotherm. But just to make it easier, I've labeled them all down here on the side, as well as the pressure levels here on the left-hand column. So our LCL here, we go across from this point to this kind of pressure level here. Looks to be just above about 850 millibars, something like 860 millibars or so. And again, we're just kind of making rough estimates. Of course, the computer programs will calculate these much more precisely. But for our purposes here, we're just kind of estimating it. It looks to be somewhere about 860 millibars. So that's how you find the LCL. Again, it's just where the parcel, when it's kind of pushed upward, becomes saturated. And I'm going to keep a list of all of our parameters here that we find over on this right side here as we find them. So next we're going to find a variable called the level of free convection, or for short, the LFC. And the LFC is really simple. It's basically the first point where the parcel becomes warmer than the environment. Or, in other words, where the parcel trace first moves to the right of the environmental temperature profile. And in this case, we look at our parcel trace, we go up, 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 and then right here is our first point where the parcel becomes warmer than the environment. And above that, you see the parcel trace is to the right of the environmental temperature profile. And that's your LFC. It's very simple. And again, it's the first point where the parcel becomes warmer than the environment. And above this point, once it reaches this point, the parcel is able to just freely rise on its own. It doesn't need any outside source, outside lifting mechanism to allow it to continue to ascend in the atmosphere. Up to the LFC, there is a lifting mechanism that is needed because the parcel is cooler than the environment. However, once it reaches that, it becomes buoyant, or it will accelerate freely on its own in the environment. So the LFC is a pressure level. So just like the LCL, it is given in millibars, but also you'll see it given in meters above ground level, particularly in the SPC products. And again, all you do is you go up on the parcel trace, and the first point where that parcel trace moves to the right of the environmental temperature profile is your LFC. So in this case, the LFC, if we just go over here, looks to be somewhere kind of right in here, which if I had to estimate would probably be somewhere around 680 millibars. So that's your LFC. And one thing to note is that the LFC will always be at or above the LCL. So let's go ahead and log that over here on the side. LFC is about 680 millibars. So the whole reason we use soundings, for the most part, is to assess the amount of instability or lack thereof in the atmosphere. And we can do that through the use of two different variables. And the first one you might have heard of before, and that is convective available potential energy, otherwise known as CAPE. And we've talked about it pretty often on this channel in some of the forecasting discussions we've done. But CAPE is basically the measure of how buoyant a parcel is, or how able it is to rise on its own. And the way you can find it on a sounding is pretty much it's the entire area between the parcel trace and the environmental temperature where the parcel is warmer than the environment. Or, in other words, the parcel trace is to the right of the environmental temperature profile. So on this particular sounding, it's going to be all this area right here between the parcel trace and the environmental temperature. And you can see here that the parcel trace is to the right of the environmental temperature, meaning that through all of this level, all this sort of layer of the atmosphere, the parcel is warmer than the environment. So T parcel, I'll abbreviate that as the temperature of the parcel, is greater than the temperature of the environment. Now, this is given in joules per kilogram, which is just an energy sort of measurement. And the more CAPE you have, the more unstable the atmosphere is. Now, we can also measure atmospheric stability through a variable called convective inhibition. And convective inhibition is basically the opposite of CAPE. It's basically negative CAPE. And it's simply the area on the between the parcel trace and the environmental temperature profile where the parcel is cooler than the environment, or the parcel trace is to the left of the temperature profile. So this pink area here is where you would have SIN, or negative buoyancy. So in this level, in this kind of layer of the atmosphere, the parcel can't rise on its own because it's cooler than the environment. And we know from just basic science that warm air rises, cold air sinks. So where this area of convective inhibition is, you would need some sort of lifting mechanism to push that parcel upward to get it up to this level, which is our LFC, as we talked about. Once the parcel hits the LFC, it's going to take advantage of this sort of positive area of CAPE, and it's going to rise on its own because the parcel is now warmer than the environment. So when you have convective inhibition, that means your parcel is cooler than the environment. Also measured in joules per kilogram. And basically the more SIN you have, the more convective inhibition you have, the more stable the atmosphere is, the less likely it is that you'll have thunderstorm development, because the atmosphere is, at least for a portion of it, stable. Now, you can't really calculate CAPE and SIN directly from the sounding, but we can at least get a qualitative sort of assessment of the stability or instability of the atmosphere from looking at a sounding. If we were to calculate this, it would take a lot of nasty calculus, a lot of integration, stuff that we can't really do off the top of our head. Of course, the SPC sites, the sites where you would get soundings, do actually calculate the CAPE much more precisely and give you, spit out a value for you. But we can get a lot of good qualitative assessment of the instability or lack thereof of the atmosphere based on just looking at the sounding. So in this particular case, we do have quite a bit of instability in the atmosphere above the LFC. However, we do have this area of convective inhibition down here that is going to make it difficult to get parcels to rise and try to tap into this positive area of CAPE. So this would be a fairly stable atmosphere down here just because we have this large area of convective inhibition below this large area of what we would call elevated instability, because it's elevated above this sort of stable layer here in the low levels. So that's CAPE, that's SIN. Of course, as we said, we can't really calculate it, but we can give a qualitative assessment of it just based on what we see on the sounding itself. So we've talked about the LFC. Now we're going to talk about the equilibrium level, or EL. And the equilibrium level is it's basically the opposite of the LFC. It is the point above the LFC, so our LFC right here, where the parcel becomes cooler than the environment. So you'd follow the parcel trace all the way up through this positive area. Then this point right here where the parcel now becomes cooler than the environment, or the parcel trace now moves to the left of the environmental temperature profile, that's your equilibrium level. And just like the LCL, just like the LFC, it is a pressure level, so given in millibars, but it can also be given in meters above ground level. And so our equilibrium level here is going to be somewhere between, pretty much halfway between 100 and 200 millibars. So I think a good estimation for this based on the sounding is going to be about 150 millibars for our equilibrium level. Now, the equilibrium level is always going to be a point above the LFC. It's basically going to be the top of the positive area of CAPE, whereas the LFC is going to be the bottom bound of the area of positive CAPE here. And it's a decent estimation of thunderstorm tops, how high a thunderstorm top can go, because it's basically the upper extent of where the parcel is buoyant. Once it hits the equilibrium level, it's no longer buoyant, whereas below that it could rise freely, but once it runs into that equilibrium level, it can really no longer rise on its own. It's no longer buoyant. Now, upward momentum is going to carry updrafts a little bit farther past the equilibrium level, but the equilibrium level is a decent estimation of storm tops. So our equilibrium level is about 150 millibars. So now let's talk about something that is often pretty close to the equilibrium level, and that is the height of the tropopause. Now, as you may know, the atmosphere has a bunch of different levels. So from the surface upward quite a ways, it's the troposphere. That's where we live. That's where pretty much all of our weather happens. And then above the troposphere is the stratosphere. And the level that separates the troposphere and the stratosphere is called the tropopause. Now, in the troposphere, temperature decreases with height in general. So obviously we can have these kind of inversions like we have on this sounding here, but in general the temperature is going to decrease as you go up in the atmosphere in the troposphere. However, in the stratosphere, temperature increases with height. And the level between the troposphere and the stratosphere is the tropopause. And the way we can find that on a sounding is that we can find where the temperature goes from decreasing with height to an abrupt change to increasing with height. And that's going to happen right about here. So you'll notice that the temperature up to this point is decreasing, 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 and then right here it switches to rapidly increasing with height. Now you may be thinking, well, why isn't the tropopause height right here? Because the temperature line starts to go vertical above that and even slant a little bit toward the right. Well, remember that our temperature lines are skewed. It's a Skew-T diagram. So our temperature lines are skewed. So even though it does look like the temperature starts to increase with height a little bit here, it is still decreasing because your temperature lines are going to be running like this. So the temperature does decrease still here with height above this level. Now, not quite as much as it did down here lower in the troposphere, but it is still decreasing with height up to this point right about here, at which point the temperature really starts to increase with height. So that level, that point right here, is going to be your tropopause height, somewhere right in here. I would say about 110 millibars or so. Not really super applicable to severe storms forecasting, but it is important for if you're doing, say, polar meteorology. You're trying to find things like tropopause folds. For a whole separate video, we're not going to talk about that now, but not super applicable to severe storms forecasting, but just so you know how to find it, that is how you find the tropopause height. So our tropopause height is about 110 millibars. So let's go through a few more. There are a bunch of different parameters we're going to go through here. I'm going to split this video up into a couple different parts just so this video isn't super long. But we'll do a few more that are kind of related to what we've talked about so far. The next parameter we'll take a look at is the convective condensation level, or otherwise known as the CCL. And what the convective condensation level is it's the level at which condensation will occur if sufficient heating causes parcels to reach saturation. So in simpler terms, it's a good estimation of the cloud base if the clouds were only caused by solar heating. So there's no other lifting mechanism present to lift parcels up in the atmosphere. So no frontal zones, no large-scale troughs. We're just talking about solar heating here. So pretty easy to find. It's a pressure level, so given in millibars or meters above ground level, just like the LFC, LCL equilibrium level. And it's fairly easy to find. All you do is you follow the mixing ratio line up from the surface dew point up to the point where it intersects the environmental temperature line. So we'll start at the surface dew point, take the mixing ratio line up, and right where it intersects the temperature, the environmental temperature profile, is your convective condensation level. So if we look over here, somewhere right in here, probably close to about 730 millibars in this particular case. So again, the CCL is basically if you had only the sun to heat the parcels near the surface, no other lifting mechanisms, what is the point that they would first become saturated? And it's a good estimation of the cloud base if we only had solar heating and no other sources of large-scale lift. So The CCL here, as we've estimated, is about 730 millibars. Now, from the CCL, we can determine the convective temperature. Now, I've talked about the convective temperature a little bit in some of my forecasting videos before, and it is really no great abbreviation for this, either ConvT, or you can do kind of T sub C. But the convective temperature is the lowest temperature to which air near the surface must be heated to in order to become buoyant, or in other words, rise on its own. So the convective temperature is given in degrees Celsius, and it's a good estimation of whether or not we're going to see convection or not, whether or not we're going to get thunderstorms. It's most useful in those regimes where you pretty much only have solar heating as the main source of lift. If you have other sources like fronts, troughs, etc., the convective temperature isn't really super important to know, because those other sources of lift are going to help erode any convective inhibition that may remain and kind of change the convective temperature. But the way you find the convective temperature is we go all the way down from the convective condensation level along the dry adiabat to the surface. And the temperature at that point, once we do that, is our convective temperature. So we started our convective condensation level, which we said was about 730 millibars. And then we're going to follow the dry adiabat all the way back down to our surface level, which is about 988 millibars. And the temperature at this point is our convective temperature. So if we kind of extrapolate here, here's our 40 degree isotherm. We're a little bit to the right of that. So the convective temperature would be something like 40, let's say 42 degrees Celsius, which is pretty warm. It's well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which at this point is going to mean that thunderstorms may be unlikely if there's no other sources of lift to help erode this layer of convective inhibition near the surface. So our convective temperature here is about 42 degrees Celsius. So the next parameter that we'll talk about, and probably the last one that we'll do in this video, we've got a bunch more parameters to go through, but just so I don't make this video super long, I'm going to break this sort of environmental parameters video into multiple parts. But so the last parameter we'll talk about today is the maximum temperature. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It is an estimate of the maximum afternoon temperature, abbreviated by MaxT, or Tmax. Now, it's not used that often. Before I was going through what I was going to do for this video, what parameters I was going to highlight in this video, I had actually never even heard of finding the maximum temperature from the sounding. But it is something you can do, particularly in environments where, again, we have only solar heating to lift parcels near the surface. Once you introduce frontal zones, large-scale troughs, other sources of lift, the maximum temperature becomes probably a little bit more inaccurate, a little less important when finding it from the Skew-T. But in those regimes where we just have solar heating to lift the parcels, it can be somewhat useful. And we want to compare it to the convective temperature, because so if the maximum temperature is greater than or equal to the convective temperature, we have a better chance of seeing thunderstorms in the afternoon. Because if you recall, the convective temperature is the lowest temperature needed for that parcels must be heated to in order to become buoyant or rise on their own. So if we can meet or exceed this convective temperature based on what the maximum afternoon high temperature is going to be, then we have a better chance of seeing thunderstorms. So if the convective temperature was, say, 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and our maximum temperature that we gain from the sounding is, say, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, then because that high temperature, we're going to exceed this convective temperature, then we can get a better chance. We have a better chance of seeing thunderstorms in the afternoon. But again, it's not used that often. It's probably easier to just go to the Weather Service forecast and pick out the high temperature for the afternoon and see whether or not we're going to exceed the convective temperature. But it can be useful in some situations. Now, the way we find the maximum temperature is we're going to start with the parcel that is 100 millibars above ground level. So here is our surface. We go up 100 millibars and find our corresponding temperature, which would be about right here. So surface level 988 millibars. So we go up to about 888. So right there is our parcel at that level. Then we're going to follow the dry adiabat down to the surface, and then we're going to add 2 degrees. So we'll follow that down to the surface, back down to 988 millibars, which would be something right about there. So our temperature there, if we just do that, is going to be, here's our 40 degree isotherm, going to be right in there. So it's going to be about 38 degrees. And then we add 2 degrees for what's called a super adiabatic contact layer near the surface. And so we talked in the previous videos about what adiabatic means. It means, no heat added or lost to the environment. And we said that our dry adiabatic lapse rate is 9.8 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Basically, the rate that an unsaturated parcel will cool as it ascends in the atmosphere is 9.8 degrees Celsius. Well, usually, oftentimes near the surface, you're going to have really intense surface heating. That surface heating is concentrated at the surface. So you can actually get lapse rates that are higher than this 9.8 degrees Celsius per kilometer in the very lowest levels of the atmosphere near the surface. So in order to account for that, we add 2 degrees to what we find by bringing that parcel at 100 millibars above ground level to the surface. So about 38 degrees, we add 2 degrees, we come up with about 40 degrees as our maximum temperature, our estimated maximum afternoon temperature. So comparing that to the convective temperature, the maximum temperature is 40 degrees Celsius, whereas our convective temperature is 42 degrees Celsius. We need the maximum temperature to be greater than or equal to the convective temperature, and that is not the case here. So in this regime as it is, without any other outside lifting mechanisms, if we had just solar heating to heat the parcels near the surface, it seems unlikely that we're going to get thunderstorms in the afternoon because that forecast estimated high temperature is less than the convective temperature. So in our column here, maximum temperature equals 40 degrees Celsius. Again, less than the convective temperature. So unlikely that we will see thunderstorms in this regime if we just have solar heating as our lifting mechanism. So I think that's a good place to leave off in this video. We'll come back in the next video. I'm going to be doing the same things. We'll look at things like the freezing level, the wet bulb temperature, and then go into some different thermodynamic variables that incorporate both temperature and moisture, such as equivalent temperature, equivalent potential temperature, etc. And it might sound like a jumble if you never heard of those words before, but we'll go in depth on how to find those and what those terms actually mean and how they're useful in making a forecast. So with that, thanks for watching. We will see you in the next video.